So, Francesca, so maybe we can prepare to start, okay?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so thank you, Francesca. So, hello everyone. Good afternoon to those from Asia and good morning to those from Europe. My name is Fiona. I'm the marketing for Europeans AQM, and I'm your MC today for this webinar. At today's section, my colleague Francesca is going to talk about 10 key points to assess during a factory visit for environmental audit. We had a very successful section on what is an environmental audit last week. In case you're interested, please go back. Please visit our YouTube channel to retrieve the recording. And so, without further ado, I will let Francesca to begin her presentation. Over to you, Francesca.
Yes, thank you, Fiona, for this introduction. Good morning, everyone. So I'm very glad to be connected again with you to have this second webinar about environmental audit. So indeed, last week we had a first webinar about getting started with environmental audit. And we are very happy because we had a lot of attendees, more than 140, so it was a big success. I was also very happy to see so many questions being asked by the participants, and indeed I have taken the time to prepare the answers, and you should have received an email with the answers to the previous webinar questions. I sent 2 emails, one with the part 1 of the answers, and the second was sent this morning about part 2. Okay, so today as well we have a 45-minute presentation. Again, we will have some polls during the presentation, so we can have an interactive session. And at the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers. Again, this presentation is recorded, and as Fiona said, we have a YouTube channel, and if needed, you can still watch this webinar again later on. For the people who are joining for the first time our webinars, I will introduce myself very briefly. So I'm Francesca Giometti. I'm a senior environmental advisor and training manager for Eurofins AQM. I used to be based in Bangladesh for more than 4 years, and I was in charge of the environmental audit service. So I could visit factories in many production countries, and I want to share with you my practical knowledge. Just checking very quickly if there is any questions. Of course, you can ask your question clicking on the icon question and answer, and Fiona will also help you in case you have any problem. Okay, so what is the agenda today? The title of this webinar is 10 key points to assess during an environmental audit. So I'm not going to present the most important points. I'm presenting a selection of 10 key points. These 10 key points I'm going to present today are key points assessed during a factory visit based on site observations. So I'm not going so much to discuss about documentation. I'm not going to discuss so much about interviews. I'm going to focus on observations on site. So I will show you a lot of pictures. So I decided to focus on 3 main topics. The first one will be chemical management. The second one will be solid and hazardous waste management in the factory. And the last chapter will be about key points regarding wastewater and effluent treatment plant management. So, of course, there are many more key points about water, about energy, about air emissions, but today I want to focus on some critical topics selected, which are chemical, waste, and ETP. Okay, first poll, before we start, I want to ask what is your current frequency, let's say, of visiting factories. So Fiona, if it is possible to show the first pool, please. So how often do you visit factories? This is a multiple choice question, so it means that not only you can answer about how often you visit factories, but as you can see, you can also indicate if you already attended some social audits and if you already attended some environmental audits. So we give you 30 seconds to answer to this first question.
Right, I think over 80% of our participants have voted already. So shall we end the poll, Francesca?
Yes.
Right. So I'm sharing now the poll results.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. So everyone should be able to see the pool results. We can see that a majority of attendees indicated that they visit both tier 1 factories and some tier 2 factories with wet process. Okay, so this is indeed a good news because what I'm going to show you during this webinar are case studies from mostly tier 2 factories. So as I explained in the first webinar, when we are looking at environmental topics in the production site, we are addressing the tier 2 factories. So if you have some experience visiting these factories, this is good. I can also see that a majority already attended social audits, but less people attended environmental audits. Still, we can see that some people have experience with attending environmental audits. Okay, so thank you, Fiona, for this first poll, and we can go to the first chapter about chemical management. And we have a second poll, indeed, to ask you, how do you evaluate your current understanding of this topic of chemical management? So Fiona, can you please open the second poll? So the first question is about how much you have heard of chemical management. And the second question is about what do you think about your suppliers' practices and experience regarding chemical management? So in the first question, we are mentioning the restricted substances list and the manufacturing restricted substances list. So maybe I can just briefly remind that the restricted substances list is the list of substances that we do not want to see in the final product. And the manufacturing restricted substances list is the list of substances we don't want to see in the production. So these are important references. So I just want to see if you are familiar with this or not.
Okay, so we also have another 80% of people voted already. So let's end the polling, okay?
Okay.
And I'm now sharing the results.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. Okay, so we can see that a majority of the attendees are familiar with both restricted substances list and manufacturing restricted substances list. So this is very good. It means the question of hazardous chemicals is known by a majority of people. And I can see in question 2 that for the attendees, they know some of their suppliers are trained about chemical management. Okay, this is indeed, I think, a good, it is in line with what I also see in the industry. The chemical management training and resources about this topic are more and more widely available for the suppliers, because indeed it is a hot topic. So I also could see that many brands were definitely focusing on chemical management for when supporting the suppliers. Okay, so we can close this pool. And again, a pool. We are going to start with analyzing this situation. So this is the, don't worry, I will not have pools every time, but just the last one for this chapter, because I want to know if you think this situation, so based on what you see on the picture, this is in a factory, do you think this situation is acceptable or something is not acceptable? So we will just have a last vote for the beginning of this webinar. Fiona, if you can have a little quiz pool.
Yeah, I think I'm sorry, I think I have missed this quiz. So I'm
okay.
Right now.
Okay, no worries. So I will go ahead. So we can see in this picture that we have some chemical containers in front of a small room, and we might wonder if this is an acceptable situation or not. Why? Because what is important, and this is a key point that is assessed by the auditor, is to control that there is a dedicated room for chemical products. So when the auditor is visiting the factory, if he noticed situations such as the ones in the picture, so maybe it is even more clear in the second picture, where you can see chemical drums being everywhere in the production section. And this is a problem. Why? Because the chemical products should be stored in a dedicated chemical store. So this is one first key point that you can easily assess as well by yourself when you're visiting a factory. If you see, for example, here, that outside the factory, chemical products are being stored in this way. So you see there is no dedicated shed, there is no restricted access. This is a problem. So why it is a problem? And why we prefer to see that, as you can see in the other pictures, the chemicals are in a specific designated area. Here you can see that in the third picture with the correct tick, you have a proper a way to close this area, and you see that in the second picture here, they want to clearly mention that the area is restricted to only authorized people. So again, what is the auditor checking? The auditor is making sure there is all chemicals are stored in a dedicated area, separated from the production section, and also the access to the chemical store should be restricted. It means there should be a closed door, and there should be a list of authorized persons to enter in the chemical storage area. So why this is important? First of all, because we want to reduce the workers' exposure to the chemicals. So when chemicals are in a single place and only a limited number of workers have access to this place, of course, it means less people are exposed to chemicals. Having a good storage system and good storage conditions for chemicals will, of course, as well help to reduce the risk of incident. And finally, another reason is to keep chemical products in good conditions, to avoid deterioration of chemicals. I remember visiting factories where some chemical products were in between, in the middle of two buildings, two production sections, and these were not empty, but the factory did not even remember what was the chemical inside, and it was just abandoned. So this is also a waste of resources. Okay, so that was one first key point, which is very easy to assess. The second one is about the segregation of incompatible chemicals. So you might know that some chemicals can react when they're in contact with each other. And this can, of course, be a big issue because it can be the source of a fire or an explosion. So it's very important, and in this case, I will make a link with documentation. Even if this is observed on site, of course, what is important is to ask the factory if they know, first of all, that some chemicals are incompatible. So of course, there is the management awareness. And then there should be as well a procedure. The factory should be able to demonstrate that there is a procedure about how to identify incompatible chemicals and how to segregate them. So this key point is also very much linked to the documentation and management system in the factory. A good practice regarding incompatible chemicals is, so we mentioned that there must be dedicated stores for chemicals. In particular, if they are flammable products in the factory, they should be a dedicated store for flammable products. So you make sure you separate the flammable products and other types of products. What we see, just want to show that in the second picture with a red cross, you have products being in the middle of the production section, and we don't even see any label and any hazard. So that's another issue we are going to discuss. So how do you check the compatibility of chemicals? There are two ways to work on this. The first one is to look at the hazard symbols. And you might have seen in some factories this type of chart where indeed, based on the hazard symbols, you know if the chemicals can be stored together or not. For example, you see that flammable products cannot be stored with corrosive products. So this is one thing. However, this is not enough, I would say, because the factory should be aware that they also need to check the safety data sheet of the chemical product. Indeed, in the safety data sheet of the chemical product, there is a section 9 about reactivity, physical and chemical, no, sorry, section 9 is about chemical and physical properties. There is another section about the reactivity. And in this section, it is also mentioned if a chemical product might react with another product. So checking the safety data sheet and looking at this kind of chart can help a factory to know how to segregate the chemicals. Why do we need to segregate chemicals? So we explained it already, but of course this is to prevent the accidental mixing, which could cause fire, explosion, or toxic gases. Okay, key point 3. This is another key point which is easy to assess in the same way as the key point 1. Maybe the key point 2 about the compatibility, it's a little bit more complex, and you might not have so much time to check the management system for analyzing the hazard of chemicals and compatibility. But you have time to, if you are visiting the factories, you need to ask to see the chemical storage area, because immediately you will understand what is the level of awareness of the management. If you see a situation such as this one, where the floor is sticky, the place is dirty. You can see that chemical drums are kept open. You can smell that there is a very, very strong odor, like acid, a kind of acid smell and vapors, a very strong. This is a problem as well. If this area is overwhelmed with too many things inside, and you cannot really understand if containers are still full or empty. If it is a bit a mess, of course, you understand the situation is critical. And a clean space, a well-organized space, is actually a good indicator of at least a kind of good awareness about chemicals. So as I explained, what you can check is how clean is the space. You can check if there is a ventilation system. So this is very important. You can see in the picture that we have an exhaust fan being visible in this chemical store. The exhaust fan, it's very important because we don't want the fumes and vapors to stay in this area. This is of course for workers, but as well vapors and fumes can lead to some problems such as fire and explosion. So another point which is mentioned here is no electrical cables in the chemical store. So this as well is a point to check. It's important to avoid any electrical connection in the chemical store. Why these points are important? Again, we want to reduce the risk of accident. We want to reduce workers' exposure to chemicals, vapors, and again, to keep chemicals in good condition. So that's our very simple things, but they are very important. Okay, this picture is showing... Yes.
The quick quiz is back. So do you want?
Okay, great. Yes, we can have a quick quiz about this picture. So I will just ask all the attendees to vote to tell us if they think this is good or it's not good. About the labeling, what would you say? So I'm not mentioning in which country is this, where was this picture taken, but let's say we are, for example, in China or in India. Actually, it doesn't make a big difference in this case.
So again, over 80% of our attendees have voted already. So let's see the result.
Okay. Okay. So yes, a majority of attendees indicated that this situation is not good. Thank you, Fiona. So indeed, this situation is not okay. Why it is not okay? Actually, this product is sodium hydroxide, and it is strongly irritating and corrosive. Do you see any hazard symbols on this chemical drum? I don't. So why don't we have the hazard symbols? How can the worker be aware of risk related to this chemical if there is no hazard symbol? So of course, this way to label a product is not okay. It's not accurate. Here there is another picture taken in a factory, in a Chinese factory, and you can see that we see the symbols. So I cannot translate now from Chinese to English, but this label is an accurate and proper label because we have the identification of the product, we have the name of the chemical supplier, we know what are the hazard statements, the precautionary statement, and we have the hazard symbols. So a proper labeling is really, really important. Why? Because we want to have a good and clear identification of hazards. Again, this key point is related to documentation. Again, here, the auditor is not only checking the labels during his on-site visit, he will also ask what is the factory chemical purchasing policy. Why? Because in this chemical purchasing policy, the factory must ask the chemical supplier to provide chemical products with correct labeling. This is the responsibility of the factory to select a chemical supplier able to provide the complete labels for each chemicals. What is the correct label? So you can look at the reference of GHS. So GHS means Global Harmonized System for the Labeling and Identification of Chemicals. So GHS is, we can say, an initiative from the United Nations. And so they want every country in the world to adopt this same system to label chemicals. This will be much more easy for the understanding and for a common system to identify the hazards. So here you have a reference. You can see that there are 6 elements in the GHS label. And so the auditor will, of course, use this reference when he's looking at the labels of the chemical products. So again, why is this labeling so important? Because we want first a correct identification of chemical hazards, and also because it's important to have the same template, I would say, for all chemical products. So it's easier for the workers to understand. Maybe you noticed in some factories, there are still some orange hazard symbols. Actually, this is an old system. Nowadays, in the chemical products should all be with this red and white hazard symbol. This is very important again. If your workers were trained about understanding the GHS hazard symbol, so this one, red and white, and then you are ordering some chemicals from a chemical supplier, and this chemical supplier is providing products with orange hazard symbol, it will be difficult for the workers to understand. So it's better to have one single system. Okay, so we are done with the chemical management chapter. I know it was a very short overview. I mentioned 4 key points. These are only few of the key points that the auditor is checking in the factory, but it was to give you an insight about the auditor job. Okay, now we can have a look to the second chapter about the solid waste management. I'm going to present 2 key points for waste management, and I want to insist on the fact that these good practices are not difficult to implement, okay? Maybe there are some environmental topics and good practice costly, of course, for the factory, but there are a lot of good practices as well which are not costly. And I want also during these webinars to show you that progress is possible without a huge investment. Okay, the situation regarding chemical drums, empty chemical drums, is usually this one. So maybe you did not notice this because it depends where you go when you visit a factory. To see the waste management, you usually need to go on the back side of a factory. You need to go around the factory. And you might see this. So mountains of empty chemical drums. You can see some empty drums being in direct contact with soil, or you can see, for example, that there is a warehouse, a kind of shed for empty drums, but you can notice holes in the roof. So these are common situations. What are the good practices? Actually, it's very simple. What is expected is to have a proper dedicated area for storing temporarily the empty drums and other type of waste. You can see that on these pictures, we have a shed with a restricted access to some hazardous waste. So what is the auditor checking exactly? So as I mentioned, there must be a dedicated shed which is away from the production sections. The ground must be hard surfaced, so we make sure there is no risk that in case there are some residues in the empty drums, we don't want any leak of hazardous substances into the ground. Of course, the roof must be in good conditions with no hole. This is to make sure there will be no rainwater infiltration and no residues, of course, inside the drums. Or if there are some residues, at least you need to make sure your drum will be really well closed and that there is no risk of any leak from your drums. Why do we check this? So the reason why this is important is to avoid soil and groundwater contamination. And we also want to avoid rainwater to be in contact with chemical drums. Having as well the empty drums in a dedicated shade away from production section is again to protect the workers, to make sure they are not exposed to hazardous waste. In the same way as we have some good practices for the empty drums, we have some good practices for the sludge. So the sludge is the byproduct of the effluent treatment plant. And okay, I had the question last time that is the sludge always hazardous or not? Actually, in many factories, the sludge is hazardous from the textile industry, textile and footwear and leather industry, because if hazardous substances are used in the production process, these substances will end up in the wastewater. And if they are in the wastewater, they will end up in the sludge. So here, some situations I faced in the factories. These are in two different countries, but very similar situation. You can see that so the sludge was put into these bags, and then the bags are in direct contact with the soil. There is no shed, so if it is raining, water will infiltrate the bags, and we might have contaminants being released into the environment. So again, the good practice is quite easy and simple to implement. Again, what we want is to avoid contact with the soil. So you need to have a proper shed for the sludge. I show you other pictures. Maybe these two pictures are good examples of how to control the sludge. So of course we are talking about what is going on site. So this is the temporary storage of sludge. So it's very basic. Sludge should not be in direct contact with the soil. It should be protected from rainwater. There should be a way to dry the sludge. Why? Because it's easier then to handle the sludge and to dispose the sludge. Again, the sludge must be temporarily stored away from production areas and must be away from people. Why? Because as I said, if there are hazardous substances in the sludge, we don't want anyone to be in contact with the sludge. What I used to see in some factories, there was no awareness about how hazardous can be the sludge, and the sludge was dumped nearby the factory in an open area where kids were just playing. So that was a big issue. In the contrary, you can see here a very good practice I observed in some factories. They had a kind of dedicated warehouse to put the bags of sludge. Okay, so this was about the waste. So I want to insist on the fact when I did initial audits and when we conducted follow-up audits, we could see a lot of progress regarding these points, because most of the time factories are not aware, but when you explain them, when they get some guideline, they can do some they can implement good practices quite quickly. Okay, the last part is about the wastewater and effluent treatment plant management. So this is a topic which I'm very happy, and I think it's very important to talk about wastewater and about ETP. Still, I think there is a lack of knowledge about this topic. There is a lack of expertise, not only from the side of a factory, but in general in the industry. So we definitely need to get to know better how an ETP works and what are the good practices regarding this. The first key point for this chapter is about water flow meters. So it's very important to install meters at the effluent treatment plant inlet and outlet points. So I try to make this flow chart, I mean, to explain in a simple way, that you have some fresh water arriving in the factory. There is the production process, which generates wastewater, and this wastewater enters in an effluent treatment plant and then will be discharged. So where do we need to install the meters? You should install a meter at the entrance of the effluent treatment plant and a meter at the outlet point. Why? Because you want to know what is the volume of wastewater entering in the ETP, and you want to make sure that the same volume is leaving the ETP to be discharged. And I would say that another important key point is actually to control that the factory is monitoring the water consumption. That's very important because we need to make sure the data are consistent. As we know that more than 80% of the water consumption of the factory is used in the wet process, we know that this should be the amount we expect to see entering in the ETP. That's very important. Water flow meters are a crucial aspect because we want to monitor the volume of wastewater, and we want to be sure that the factory is actually treating 100% of the wastewater. This is to be sure there is no bypass. So regarding the meters, you have different type of meters. You can have this type of electromagnetic meter installed on a pipeline, and you have also other types of meters. And this is important to know because you might have factories telling you, we cannot install a meter at the inlet point because the wastewater is passing through an open channel, not a pipeline. So if this is the case, of course, you cannot install the electromagnetic meter, but you have other options. You can have a kind of sensor which is installed at the inlet open channel of the plant, and it is connected to a control system with a screen, and you can see the flow of wastewater entering in the ETP. So there are different solutions. When a factory is telling you, I cannot install the meter, you have to investigate. Huh? What is important is, of course, not only to install the meter, but to be sure the meter is properly installed. Oh, yes. I will show you. Here I have a little video. So this is the situation where there is a control system device with a screen where you can see in real time what is the flow of water being measured. So I will play this. So you see that the numbers are changing very fast. So we were at 100 something, then it was 30, 40, 60, 90, 170. So this, this is not normal. This is an evidence that the meter is not correctly installed. Okay, so when you see that numbers are jumping from one to another, it means that probably the pipe is not full of water. There is some air passing through. So the meter is not providing accurate information. So again, why do we need to install water flow meters? Because we want to control that the wastewater volume to be treated is within the ETP capacity. This is as well indeed very important, because sometimes a factory might have built an ETP which is quite small compared to what they will need for the entire volume of wastewater. But why they do so? Because of course it is a matter of money. They want to spend less money for ETP. To check, of course, why also we need to have these meters again, because we need to compare the water used in the production and the wastewater generated. Yes, this was again to show you the difference in the numbers we can see on the meter. This is something you can do actually. You can, when you visit the factory, you can ask, oh, can I see the water flow meter device for your ETP? And you can have a look to the screen, and you will see if there is some strange gap in the numbers, or if it is a steady measurement. Okay, again, I would like the pool, the little quiz from Fiona. Do you think this water flow meter is well installed or not? Okay, so of course you're not an expert. You might not be an engineer of wastewater treatment and water flow monitoring tools, but still maybe you have an idea of this is okay or not.
So I think the pool situation this time is a bit more interesting, not so overwhelming as the previous one.
Ah, interesting.
Yes. So I think it's also close to 80% voted. So let's see the result and who is right and who are wrong.
Okay, indeed. So we have 72 people who said no, it's not good, and 32 who said yes, it's okay. Okay, so that's very interesting. So unfortunately, I cannot ask the attendees to give me their explanation, but I'm going to give the solution. So we can close the pool. Actually, this is not correct. As you can see, if the flow meter is really at the end of the pipeline, there is a risk of air entry. I show you what would be a better installation of the meter. What we want, again, and remember, we want to make sure that the flow meter is installed on a way where we are sure the water pressure will be enough to make sure the pipe is always full of water. So that's very important. In any case, maybe you cannot assess every time by yourself if the meter is well installed. What you need to do, and what the auditor is doing, is actually to ask the factory, how did you install the meter? How did you know the meter was well installed? Can you show me, when you purchase a meter, you must have a guideline, instructions about how to install the meter, how to make the maintenance of the meter. So again, there is some documentation that should be checked regarding the meters. So that's something indeed to investigate. That also I want to insist on. A good auditor is indeed the auditor who will not only say, okay, there is a meter, check. No, he will go more in details. He needs to be sure the meter is properly installed, because if there is a meter and the data are not accurate, this is useless, of course. Okay, another key point which I found very, very interesting about the wastewater and ETP, and again, you don't need to be an expert to do this. You can, and the auditor is doing it, observe a water sample at ETP outlet point. So first of all, you need to identify where is the ETP outlet point. So this is, you need the factory to show you where is the last, from where they collect, let's say, the sample after the final treatment steps. Okay, you have a sample. What can you check? You can smell it. If there is a bad smell, this is not normal. You can look at the foam. If there is a persistent foam at the top of the glass, the recipient where you have your sample, if the foam is not disappearing after a few seconds, 1 minute, if you still have foam, this is also not normal. You can look at suspended solids. You see in the second picture here, turbidity level. If you see all these suspended elements, this is not normal, because the wastewater treatment plant is supposed to remove solid particles. So if you still have solid particles at the ETP outlet point, it means there is a problem with the process. And you can also pay attention to the temperature. If the water is very, very hot, that's strange. So it's important as well. And finally, the color. So color is a big, I mean, it's not as simple as you think. It's not like, okay, if there is a treatment plant, the water should be transparent at the end. No, it's not always like this, because it depends on the effluent treatment processes. Not all the ETPs have the same processes. In many factories, there is a basic treatment process. It means only chemical and sometimes biological treatment process. In this case, you cannot have transparent water at the end. It's not possible. But it doesn't mean that because it's slightly colored, it's a big issue. Huh? You can see on this picture, the one with the green tick, the water is slightly colored, but you can see, if you put your hands behind the sample, you can see it. So it means the water is only slightly colored. So just again, to insist on the fact that the auditor is spending a lot of time observing what is going on in the ETP. He will not only check the water test report. This is only documentation. It's important, but it's one aspect. The auditor must have a look to different indicators, different criteria when he's observing a water sample, and these criteria help the auditor understand if the process seems to be normal or if there are some troubles with the process. In the same way as you can observe the sample at ETP outlet point, you can also observe the different ETP tanks. Some examples: if you see a tank with steady water, not moving, it seems sticky, there are some bubbles, there are some solid floating elements, that's not normal, okay? The effluent treatment plant looks clean. It has to be a fluid. I mean, water is always flowing. It's not steady. I show you here, for example, this video. You see, this is what we call a clarifier. So it's one of the steps of the ETP. And you see, water is always flowing. Water is always moving, and I mean, it's clean. It looks clean. I mean, it's not a big smell. It's not full of foam. It's not. It has to look like this. Here as well, you can see an aeration tank, and you see Okay, it's always bubbling, it's always moving. Okay, that's very important. This is also the screening system at the before the treatment starts. You have what we call the screening. Usually you have a device with automatic screening. So like in the first picture, it's a kind of rotary system to screen the wastewater and remove solid particles. On the second picture, you see that there is a guy doing this manually. So why? You see, it's not normal that this guy is doing this manually. There should be a proper system for the screening. So this is also interesting to observe. You can also have a look inside the factory in the production sections. Below the machines, for example, this is in a denim laundry. In the first picture, we see that there are so many solid particles, foam, and the water cannot flow normally. That's a problem. It is definitely an evidence of a poor management of wastewater. In the second picture, you see that we don't see such problem. So again, I want to insist on the fact that the auditor has to observe very carefully the wastewater management during the site visit. And to give you an idea, the ETP visit during an environmental audit is at least 1 hour. Okay, another interesting key point checked by the auditor is there an on-site lab? Okay, I don't want to say maybe laboratory, but I would say that at least there should be testing process on site for the ETP. Many factories will tell you, no, we don't have a laboratory on site, we just send a sample to an external lab. Actually, this is not enough. The factory must have some instruments on site to perform on-site tests. Why? Because testing the water is part of the control system of an effluent treatment plant. So I'm not saying that the factory must have an incredible laboratory accredited ISO 70025. No, of course not, but the factory can have some instruments for some specific tests, such as the pH, such as dissolved oxygen, such as chemical oxygen demand. Okay, these are very important tests to be conducted on site. So the auditor is going to check the instruments for testing. He will ask how the instruments are calibrated. He will ask to see the procedures for the testing and, of course, the records. So that's very, very important. If you want to demonstrate that you have a good monitoring of your effluent treatment plant, you need to have the instruments to do some important tests by yourself on site. This is for a good monitoring of the wastewater treatment. Okay, so I'm done for the presentation of the key points. So this was really an insight about the job of the environmental auditor. So I also want to insist on the fact that some good practices can be easily implemented by the factories. And also I want to insist on the fact that the environmental audit, sure, it's technical, but still you as well, when visiting your factories, you can definitely check some of the key points we presented today. Now, I would like, before we go for the question, a last poll to ask what you think is the best way to support factories in making progress. Why I'm asking this question? Because audit is necessary to make a diagnostic, to know, okay, what is the situation in my factory? However, we know that the audit is not the solution to address root causes. So what will be needed to help the factories? Okay, so maybe give you some time to answer this question.
Yeah, I think they need maybe some 10 or 15 seconds more to think about the answer.
Yes, sure.
All right, so we have about 82, 83% of people vote already. So let's see the result. So Francesca, you can see the result now?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Fiona. Indeed, I'm seeing as you the poll's result. So a majority voted for auditing the factory and ensuring a follow-up plan. Okay. Then we have provide live training programs focusing on specific topics. And then people also interested in the e-learning courses in local language. Okay, so that's interesting to see that a majority of people attending this webinar consider that actually auditing the factory and having a proper follow-up plan is a good way to support factories. Indeed, I did not only say audit the factory in this question, I really insisted on ensure follow-up plan. As you know, if there is an initial audit conducted and there is no follow-up, of course, the factory won't be encouraged to make progress. So the follow-up is definitely important. It might be difficult indeed when you have a lot of factories and limited resources. So as you know, audit companies are usually also providing this support for the follow-up. It might not be always only re-audit. It can be as well what we call the desktop follow-up, which means that you can start looking at the evidence of corrective actions being corrected from a remote assistance. I mean, from a computer, you can do this. So there are some alternatives, but definitely trainings will be also needed to support the factories. Okay, thank you. So we can close the pool, and we are going to look at the questions.
Yeah, so we have quite a good number of questions already. So I don't think we'll be able to answer all of them here live, but don't worry, we'll follow up the questions with email. So I know that it is almost an hour already. So in case you need to leave for another engagement, we'll understand that. But for those who want to stay a little bit longer, so I think Francesca, we can stay for another 5 or 10 minutes to take some questions.
Yes.
And so we should start with our first question. Okay, so our first question is about the SDS. Is it used to keep in store only, or will it be placed at other places as well?
Okay, so about the safety datasheet location, what is usually recommended? First of all, the factory should collect from the chemical supplier the original safety datasheet for each chemical. And this, I mean, the documentation from the chemical supplier is firstly needed for the management, analyzing the chemical hazard and checking the information about chemicals. For the workers, I would say that we have to, of course, have in mind that a worker is not going to read a 15 pages safety data sheet. Of course not. The safety data sheet original version should be as well available in the production, in the chemical store, where I would say a key worker, so a manager of for example, the production manager of the chemical store in charge. This person again should have access to the safety data sheet. But for the workers, actually, the most important for the worker is to understand when he is manipulating a chemical product, what are the hazards, what are the precautionary measures, how to protect, of course, his health, and what to do in case of incident. It means I recommend factories to have a simple template, a shorter template for safety data sheet, where they only indicate in local language the key information about the product. So only hazards with very clear symbols, precautionary statements, PPE to be used, and what to do in case of incident. So it can be a shorter version of SDS in local language, which is more adapted to the worker. This is what I can say for the moment.
Okay, thank you, Francesca. So the next question is about the labeling. And is there another way to use the labeling for the people to read, as the worker mostly they don't have very good education and they may not understand what the label means?
Yes, indeed. So this is very much related to what we said before. Yes, again, the label is important. Don't always think that safety data sheet labels are for the workers. It's not only for the workers, it's for the factory management, for the person from the management who is in charge of, for example, working on restricted substances list, the one in charge of chemical inventory, in charge of all the procedures related to chemical. Because label and safety data sheet are key documentation to know what are the hazardous substances being used in the factory. So keep this in mind. Labeling and safety data sheet are firstly important for the manager in the factory. For the workers, again, you need to find in your factory a simple way to display the key information workers need. They need to see the hazard symbols, and you need to train, of course, workers about recognizing these hazard symbols. You need as well to train the workers about what type of mask they need to use. You need to explain how to manipulate the chemical safely. Probably the training is more important than some documentation displayed in the factory, because we know workers might not be reading, so they need to see the symbols, but they mostly need to be trained. Also, I insist on the fact that it's important to try to have less workers being manipulating chemicals. The less workers are using chemicals, the less, people are exposed. And it's better to have fewer workers, but well-trained, than to have every workers being eventually in contact with chemicals and not trained.
Okay, the next question is also about the chemical labeling. So is the labeling applicable only for primary container, or should it be also used on a secondary container? And in case of a mixture, what label should the manufacturer use?
Okay, that's a very good question. Indeed, this is a situation I remember facing a lot of time. We are visiting the factory, and in the production section, there are some container with no label. And when we ask what it is, they answer, oh, but this is just a temporary container. So why we should have a label for this? So what is usually a good practice in this case? Even if it is a secondary container, even if it is a temporary container, there must be a little, how can I say, a poster with the name of the chemical product and the hazard symbols. At least this is fundamental, just for anyone working in the production section to immediately know, okay, this is this and these are the hazards. That's something I can answer.
Okay. Another question is about the sludge from ETP. When it is removed, what happened to it?
Very good question. So it depends on the country, I would say. Even at the regional level, it depends. There are different possibilities regarding what is done with the sludge. And that's indeed a key point, because as we said, the sludge might contain hazardous substances. We try to encourage factories to be aware of the final disposal of sludge. Why? Because in some countries, the sludge might be just dumped in a landfill. It might be burned, and in this case, hazardous substances will be released in the environment. So during an environmental audit, the auditor is challenging the factory about, are you aware of the final disposal of sludge? If not, you should try to investigate, because you need to select waste contractors being transparent about what will be done with the waste. And you want to select a waste contractor with a more environmental friendly practice. To give some example of good practices with waste, with sludge, in countries where there are not much options regarding waste disposal options, probably for sludge, what is a good option is to send the sludge to the cement industry rather than brick. I know that in Bangladesh, for example, they send the sludge to the brick manufacturing, but actually that's not the best option. Cement will be better. But again, it depends on countries and specific possibilities that are in the region.
So maybe we'll take two more questions before we end the webinar. Next question is about the water meter. Should the water meters be calibrated?
Yes, of course. Of course, the calibration for meters is really, really important. So you again, when a water meter is purchased, it is explained how to do the maintenance of the meter and how to check the calibration. So this is now a bit technical, but it is of course part of when installing a water meter, every information will be provided about calibration.
Right. So our next question, our final question is a very good one. So one of our attendees asked if our company is capable to do the ETP assessment in Bangladesh and China.
Okay. Yes, indeed, we don't do only environmental audits. We also offer audits about specific topic. And indeed, the audit of the ETP is one of our services. And it's really interesting, actually, because there are so many interesting things to look at when controlling the wastewater management and ETP, that this can be a single audit topic. And we did some ETP audits in Bangladesh already, and we can do it in China as well. Yes.
Right, thank you, Francesca. So here comes an end to our QA section. We know that there are over 20 questions unanswered, and so don't worry, Francesca will provide a written answer by email in the coming few days. So let's move to the takeaway.
Yes, so I want to conclude this webinar before we leave. So what did we learn today? First of all, we learned about the chemical management, some of the chemical management good practices. So I insist on the fact that what is really important is first to have a factory management being aware and being ready to have the chemical management as a board agenda. It must be part of the strategy of the factory to decide to have a proper chemical management system. This is fundamental. Once there is a management decision to work on this topic, good practices implemented would be to have a dedicated store for the chemical, to have a proper segregation of incompatible chemicals, to have a correct identification of chemical hazard through the GHS labeling, and to have safe and clean spaces to reduce the risk of accidents. These are just examples, and you can have as well a dedicated audit for chemical management because there are so many important points to check in the factory about chemical management. This is just an insight. Then we talk about waste. So regarding the waste management, there are some simple actions that can be taken. I suggest to focus on the hazardous waste. So focusing on empty chemical drums and sludge, because what we want to do is to avoid the risk of soil contamination during the on-site storage phase. And for this, there are simple steps that can be taken. Having a dedicated warehouse for hazardous waste with roof in good condition and hard surface floor. So that's easy to implement. And finally, again, we can discuss for one day about effluent treatment plant, but I try to make just give you an insight about some of the key points usually checked. So wastewater management key points in today were water flow meters correctly installed, the observation of the ETP outlet water sample, and also the observation of the ETP tanks, and a minimum lab equipment which is needed on site for good monitoring of the wastewater treatment. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you to the next webinars.
Yeah, and as Francesca mentioned, we have 2 more webinars coming up next week and the week after. So we hope we'll see you there. And when you, just a favor to ask for after you leave the webinar, so there should be a survey page popping up. So please help us to complete the survey form and let us know how you feel about the webinars. And you will be getting a follow-up email tomorrow telling you where to get the recording and the presentation file. I hope you enjoyed the webinar and the time with us. So see you guys next week and the week after. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.